Let me tell you all something right off the bat. When the world wasn't watching, when the spotlight was on someone else, India made a move so bold, so precise, so full of vision that it didn't just turn heads, it spun them right off their axis. This wasn't just another headline. It was a tectonic shift in global strategy. And it didn't only make ripples in Washington or Beijing, it shook boardrooms in London, rattled policy halls in Brussels, and made even the most skeptical nations recalibrate. See, they say the smartest players in the game don't make noise, they move in silence. And baby, India moved like a master chess player with one hand behind its back, calm, composed, calculating, and still knocked the king off the board with a smile that said, "You never saw this coming." Now let me ask you, how many times has India been written off? How many times has the world looked down at its slums and called it backward? How many times have they chuckled at the chaos, mocked its multilingual reality, underestimated the soul of a billion dreams beating in unison? They thought India would remain tangled in its own complexities. They said caste would break it, borders would choke it, religions would divide it. They assumed India would always be too busy cleaning its internal mess to ever become a global player. But while they mocked, India meditated. While they analyzed, India strategized. While they laughed, India learned. And while they underestimated, India evolved. See, when you're watching the wrong screen, the real story happens where the cameras aren't pointed. That's exactly what India did. In the middle of geopolitical theater, while the West was busy spinning in its own web of interventions, proxy wars, and inflation spikes, India dropped a masterstroke that didn't require applause. It required attention. Not because it was loud, but because it was effective. Because it made the world realize they were no longer looking at a player. They were looking at a power. And the reason it hit so hard isn't because the world didn't know India had the muscle. It's because they didn't believe India had the courage to flex it. But courage, grit, perseverance, that's been in India's blood since before the modern world even had maps. You have to understand this wasn't a reaction. This wasn't panic politics or a rushed policy pivot. This was years of planning colliding with the perfect moment. This was what happens when preparation meets purpose. When patience kisses opportunity, when resolve refuses to sleep, India played the long game while others chased headlines. It took its time not because it was slow, but because it was intentional. And when the moment finally came, India didn't just step into it. It owned it like it was born for it. Because it was. Let me break it down for you. While America was busy playing world police, imposing sanctions, running covert operations, and juggling internal division, and while China was drowning countries in debt traps disguised as development loans, India was busy building something entirely different. India was building relationships, not shallow transactional deals, but meaningful, mutually beneficial relationships that could stand the test of time and ideology. Strategic partnerships rooted in trust, trade routes rooted in necessity, defense deals rooted in equality, space collaboration rooted in innovation. It wasn't just building bridges, it was building entire blueprints for a new world order, quietly, deliberately, diligently. And the beauty of it, India didn't brag, it didn't make noise, because India understands something the modern world has forgotten. Real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need likes, shares, or trending hashtags. Real power is built in silence, under the radar, in the shadows of loud empires. And that's why it lasts. India didn't try to outmatch the West missile for missile or dollar for dollar. It understood the new currency, leverage, intellectual capital, technological supremacy, human potential, soft power, cultural influence, data sovereignty. It built its brain trust. It developed space engineering. It dove deep into biotech. It funded defense R&D. It empowered its scientists and unleashed its entrepreneurs. And what do you know? Suddenly, the top tech firms in the world, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, were being run by Indians. You think that's a coincidence? That's not a lucky break. That's generational preparation meeting a global shift. That's what happens when you stop asking for permission and start building your own foundation. India didn't just break into the global system. It became the system. It didn't just adapt to the algorithm. It rewrote it. And once that happened, the narrative flipped. Nations that once dismissed India as a chaotic democracy were now calling it a stabilizing force. Countries that refused to share technology were now lining up to sell and collaborate. Corporations that once saw India as just a labor market were now recognizing it as an innovation hub. Suddenly, the entire world realized this isn't the India they read about in outdated textbooks. This is a new beast. And that beast isn't growling for attention. It's commanding it. Now let's talk military. Because for decades, India was painted as a reactive power. But what they didn't see was the slow, quiet transformation happening beneath that label. BrahMos missile deals, domestic fighter jets, drone programs, indigenous aircraft carriers, submarines, anti-satellite weapons, and then came the export push. India didn't just beg for defense tech anymore. It built its own. And now, it's exporting it to the very countries that once refused to sell to it. That's poetic justice. That's strategic revenge. That's power flipping the script. And while all this was happening, India made one of its smartest moves yet. It stopped chasing Western validation. It stopped waiting for applause from the elite press, the think tanks, the Ivy League analysts. It stopped begging for approval and started writing its own playbook. Rejected global narratives that were biased, confronted media that was skewed, and began shaping a discourse that prioritized Indian interests, Indian people, Indian identity. It stopped asking for a seat at the table and said, "We'll build our own damn table." And baby, once you do that, you don't worry about who's sitting where, you host your own summit. While Europe scrambled over gas shortages and America played chess with OP ice, India redefined the energy game. It diversified suppliers, signed oil deals with countries the West boycotted, paid less for more, and kept its economy steady. And that wasn't just economic genius. That was negotiation with dignity. That was strategic autonomy in action. That was a masterclass in energy diplomacy. And don't even get me started on space. Because while the big names were spending billions to get to the moon, India did it on a budget smaller than some Hollywood films. Chandrayaan didn't just land on the moon. It landed India's flag on the map of nations with true cosmic ambition. That wasn't just scientific. It was symbolic. It declared to the world, we're not behind. We're just taking a different route. And sometimes the different road gets you further than the crowded one. But let's zoom out now. The move that shocked the world. It wasn't a flash in the pan. It was decades in the making. It was years of setbacks that became lessons. It was centuries of being underestimated that became fuel. It was a new mindset. A mindset not seeking charity but commanding respect. This isn't the India of the 90s begging for IMF loans. This isn't the India of the early 2000s waiting in line for trade approvals. This is a tiger, patient, focused, razor sharp, and now finally out of the cage. And when that tiger walks, the whole jungle listens. Some still mock, some still doubt. But to them I say, name one great power that rose without pain. America had its dark chapters. Europe had its wars and plagues. China had its revolutions and famines. And India had all that plus foreign occupation, partition, centuries of colonization. And still, it educated millions. Still, it launched moon missions. Still, it became the world's largest democracy. Still, it rose. That's not just resilience. That's legacy. That's legend. And India didn't rise by copying anyone else. It rose by being unapologetically itself. Diverse, vibrant, chaotic, unpredictable, emotional, soulful. That's the very essence of its magic. That's the chaos that births creativity. That's the madness that births innovation. That's the noise that masks a symphony. Every time they mocked, India made a move. Every time they doubted, India delivered. And every time they looked away, India laid another brick in the foundation of its future. And now that future is not knocking on the door, it's kicking it down. The world is watching, stunned, because while they were busy writing India off, India was writing its own destiny. With steel in its backbone, fire in its belly, and clarity in its mind. Because this new India isn't reacting to the world anymore. It's making the world react to it. Look at the geopolitical chessboard today. The United States now needs India not as an optional partner, but as a strategic necessity to balance the aggression of China. Russia leans toward India not just because of history, but because of balance. The Middle East is turning to India not out of ideology, but because of India's consistent neutrality, steady diplomacy, and growing economic clout. Europe needs India's market. Africa looks to India as a development partner that won't exploit but uplift. Southeast Asia sees India not as a rival, but as a cultural sibling. This isn't influence. This is gravitational pull. This is what happens when a country doesn't play by anyone else's rules and instead defines its own terms. And those terms are rooted not in dominance, but in self-respect. India's strength lies in what others called its weakness, complexity, chaos. contradictions. But those aren't flaws, those are assets. Because where the world sees fragmentation, India sees layers. Where the world sees noise, India hears harmony. Where others see a mess, India sees a mosaic. And only a civilization that thrives in complexity can build systems that last. Only a nation born in diversity can manage diplomacy in a world that's rapidly dividing. India didn't need to erase its identity to be accepted. It amplified it. And now that cultural identity is being exported. Bollywood isn't just entertainment anymore. It's soft power. Yoga isn't just exercise. It's a way of life that brings in millions in wellness tourism and positions India as a spiritual guide. Ayurveda is redefining health beyond pills. Indian cuisine, Indian festivals, Indian clothing, Indian design. These aren't just cultural exports, they're influence. And in a world searching for meaning beyond consumerism, India's ancient wisdom is now being seen as the missing piece. India's rise is also psychological. It's the shift from apologizing to asserting, from waiting to leading, from listening to telling. The country that once waited for IMF certificates and Western validations now writes its own economic playbook. Digital infrastructure like UPI, Aadhaar, and Jan Dhan wasn't imported. It was invented in India for India. And now it's being showcased globally as a model. Imagine this. Villages in remote parts of the country connected to real-time banking, digital health services, educational platforms. That's not just progress. That's transformation. While developed countries still struggle with fragmented systems, India built a digital spine that supports 1 billion people. That's the kind of leap that doesn't make headlines every day, but becomes history later. India's foreign policy has matured into something the world didn't expect, calm assertiveness. It's not aggressive, but it's immovable. It doesn't bark, but it doesn't back down either. When the West tried to isolate Russia, India didn't follow the script. It bought oil at a discount, managed to keep inflation in check, and didn't apologize for it. Because it was thinking of its people, not of PR. When tensions rose in global forums, India didn't just deliver speeches, it delivered logic, balance, and direction. It voted based on interest, not ideology, and when it needed to, it simply said no. No to being pressured, no to being bullied, no to being used. That kind of refusal comes not from arrogance, but from confidence. The kind that's built over decades of quiet growth. And you want to know the real game changer? India didn't rise with imperialism. It didn't invade anyone. It didn't colonize, enslave, or pillage. It didn't build a war machine to force others into submission. It rose through intellect, through innovation, through integrity. That's a rise the world isn't used to. Because in history, superpowers usually rise by crushing others. India's rising by elevating itself. And that makes it not just powerful, but admirable. Especially for countries in the global south that are now seeing India as the template, not the West, not China, but India. A country that rose without losing its soul. The old global order thrived on dependency. But India bet on self-reliance. Make in India wasn't just a slogan. It became a manufacturing revolution. From mobile phones to fighter jets, from vaccines to semiconductors, India is building what it used to buy. And it's doing it with scale and quality. That's why foreign companies are shifting their factories to India. That's why the world's supply chains are now being recalibrated. Because India is reliable. It's resilient. It's redefined what emerging economy actually means. And as other powers struggle with inflation, aging populations, political polarization, and labor shortages, India has something they don't: youth, energy, optimism, drive. Over half the population under 30, millions of engineers, creators, scientists, thinkers. This demographic dividend is not just a number. It's a revolution waiting to happen. But don't mistake this youth for naivety. Because this generation doesn't want to leave India to succeed. It wants to build India to succeed. Startups are booming. Unicorns are emerging. Investment is pouring in. And it's not just from outside, it's from within. This generation believes in Bharat. It doesn't see its culture as a burden. It sees it as a launch pad. It wears tradition with pride, and yet it codes in the latest AI languages. It performs classical dance while launching tech companies. That fusion of ancient and futuristic, that's the Indian advantage. Even in the international arena, India has done what no one expected. It became the voice of the voiceless. Vaccine Maitri wasn't just charity. It was soft power diplomacy at its finest. When rich countries hoarded vaccines, India sent them out. When disasters struck, India sent rescue teams, not rhetoric. When countries needed help without a lecture, India showed up with compassion. And that matters now more than ever, because in a world tired of coercion, India offers cooperation. And that cooperation comes with no strings attached. That's why India's influence feels more genuine, because it isn't just about deals, it's about dignity. Now look at how global media is shifting. For decades, India was covered through a lens of stereotypes: poverty, pollution, population. But today, even the biggest networks are being forced to shift their tone, because the reality is undeniable. You can't ignore a nation that's building billion-dollar startups every week. You can't mock a country that's landing on the moon's south pole. You can't dismiss a democracy that continues to thrive despite its diversity. The West, which once lectured India, now listens. The East, which once competed with India, now collaborates. The global South, which once waited for help, now looks to India for hope. This wasn't a PR miracle. This was a policy miracle. Years of careful groundwork, of building infrastructure, digitizing systems, deregulating industries, pushing reforms, and unleashing entrepreneurship. It's the long game, the hard game, the one with no shortcuts. And the most dangerous player is the one who plays long, because they don't panic, they prepare. They don't shout, they strike when ready. That's exactly what India has done. And this mindset didn't come from textbooks. It came from centuries of civilizational learning, from Vedas to space tech, from Upanishads to microchips, from temples to startups. India has always blended the material with the metaphysical. And that's what makes it unstoppable. Because when a country knows who it